If you listen carefully, at the end, you'll be someone else. Since the death of a guest in 1927 at the Cecil Hotel, an ominous and malevolent presence has deterred many visitors from staying there. Some guests checked out abruptly without completing their stay, while others mysteriously disappeared without a trace just days after checking in. These unsettling events, along with various other anomalies, have repeatedly drawn the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department over the years. However, despite extensive investigations, most of the cases were eventually dismissed due to a lack of concrete evidence. The police were left with no choice but to attribute these occurrences to superstition, especially given the bizarre fact that, in almost every case, the missing persons files inexplicably vanished, leaving no leads behind. It was January 28 in 2013 when Elisa Lam checked into the Cecil Hotel. Her motivation wasn't the usual curiosity of a fashionable event driving her. This time it was the need to escape after a tumultuous month of sharing her struggles with mental illness on her blog. She embarked on this journey with the hope of clearing her mind. Her enthusiasm for this trip was palpable. She was vibrant and full of life, so what could possibly go wrong? 3 days preceding the time she logged in to the Cecil, Elisa had fun hanging out alone at tourist locations in Los Angeles. She took several pictures to keep her fans up to date, as the die-hard blogger she is. One of the last places she visited was the zoo, where she enthusiastically posed in front of various animals and captured several snapshots. The atmosphere was relaxing, with the melodic chirping of birds in the background and the rhythmic sounds of animals playing and splashing in the water. As Elisa strolled down the zoo's pathways, a little girl suddenly ran up to her and tightly held on to her arm. She wore a half-moon smile at Elisa, who stared at the little girl surprisingly, trying to figure out if they had met before. "Would you like to take a picture with me?" the little girl asked. "Sure, why not?" Elisa replied. Elisa crouched down and gently drew her closer. With a couple of clicks on her camera, she reciprocated the little girl's smile and showed her the pictures. The little girl began to run off, but stopped a few blocks away and ran back to Elisa. "Are you new in town?" the little girl asked. "Yes, I am. And what is your name, honey?" Elisa answered, hoping to start a conversation with her. "My mom calls me Mary. A word of caution, ma'am. Don't go to the Cecil. They say the hotel eats people." And before Elisa could comprehend what she said, the little girl was already off, out of the zoo, and mixed into the crowd in the street. Elisa was puzzled. She stood dumbfounded for a while, watching the busy crowd in the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of little Mary again. She was no longer there. Elisa wiped her brow, attempting to shake things off and continue her tour. Yet, in the back of her mind, that haunting little voice kept echoing, repeating the cryptic warning. "Don't go to the Cecil. The hotel eats people." After a long day touring the town, Elisa stopped at a cafe. She ordered a coffee and a donut, and decided to go through her phone gallery to select the best photos for her blog. That was when she noticed something unusual. The photos she had taken with the little girl had inexplicably become blurred, even though they were okay a while ago when she checked. Maybe it's a virus, Or an error with my phone's camera, she thought. Elisa tried to dismiss it as a technical glitch with her phone, but a question lingered in her mind. Why had it affected only the photos with the little girl? After some contemplation, Elisa decided to put the incident aside for the time being. She went outside the cafe and walked down the road in search of a cab. The journey was slow and the traffic was heavy. The cab driver looked into the rear mirror several times, hoping to catch a glimpse of Elisa's face. However, she remained absorbed in her phone, never once looking up from the screen. Finally, he broke the silence. Why the Cecil? The question cut her mutual connection with the phone. Elisa looked up and met his gaze through the rearview mirror, offering a terse response. Because it's cheap. Trying to get the cab driver out of her hair. The cab driver, unsatisfied, asked again. It seems like you're new in town. Haven't you heard the news lately? Elisa chose to remain silent. The cab driver did not talk anymore. She remained fixated on her phone, lost in her own world. It was a cold and uninteresting ride. As she dropped off in front of the hotel, the cab driver peered out of the side glass and looked straight into her eyes. Beware of this place. Many stories are flying around. This hotel eats people. The cab driver did not collect the money for the fare. He stepped his feet on the gas and sped in the opposite direction. Elisa stood for a moment, staring at the cab as it drove off, leaving a trail of white smoke behind. Then she stared at the hotel, then at the cab, which was now far away, and to the hotel again, before taking the bold steps. As Elisa stepped into the hotel, an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. An eerie, ghostly feeling seemed to envelop her. Everything, even the walls of the hotel, appeared to pulse with an uncanny energy. After a deep breath to steady herself, she walked over to the reception desk and requested a shared room. Luckily, there was one available on the 5th floor. Apart from the receptionist's warm attitude, everything else was cold and unwelcoming. As Elisa walked down the hallway to the elevator, she felt an intangible presence trailing behind her. She heard someone whisper her name. She turned around, scanning the empty hallway, but there was no one to be found. Elisa pressed the button for the elevator and waited. However, nothing happened. Then pressed the button again. After waiting for a while, again, she decided to walk back to the reception. As she took a few steps away, she heard a distinct clicking sound and the elevator doors opening. Surprised, she began to walk back towards the now open doors. However, the doors were already starting to close. The doors were almost fully closed when Elisa got back to the elevator. There was a small space left between the doors, but large enough to peep through. She walked and leaned to peer through the space inside the elevator at the last second and saw herself inside before the doors closed completely. Elisa stood frozen for some seconds, then pressed the button again. This time the doors opened immediately. The elevator was empty. Elisa entered the elevator, noting that there were no mirrors inside. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking some breaths, then pressed the 5th floor button. When the elevator reached the floor, she went out and walked straight to her room. She flung her bag on the bed and fell flat on it. What an eventful day, she murmured to herself. Elisa stared at the ceiling as her thoughts swirled with the experiences of the day. She rolled over to acknowledge the presence of the other ladies sharing the room with her. One of them was of Chinese descent, like Elisa. She approached Elisa with a friendly smile on her face and struck up a conversation. They had a long chat through the night, before retiring to sleep. As the clock struck 1 a.m., a window flung open brusquely, letting the cold breeze rush into the room, bringing with it swirling particles of snow. The other girls woke up, but Elisa was still fast asleep, despite being next to the window. One of the ladies tried tapping her, attempting to wake her to close the window. Elisa remained deep in her sleep, so the girl leaned over to Elisa's corner and tried to close the window. Suddenly, Elisa's eyes opened. Her body started to contort and convulse violently, jerking unnaturally as though she was overtaken by an invisible force. The whites of her eyes were filled with darkness. The other girls watched, paralyzed by the surreal spectacle. All the other windows flung open simultaneously, their curtains floating violently. Terrified, the other girls huddled together in a corner of the room. Trails of frost crawled up the walls and window frames. Particles of snow rushed into the room. One of the girls picked up the courage and made her way to Elisa's bed. With trembling hands, she gently placed them on Elisa's shoulders. All stopped abruptly. The other girls rushed to close the windows. Elisa woke up feeling drained and tired. What in heaven's name was that? One of the girls asked, still shivering to the toes. However, Elisa was looking at her, confused, without understanding what she was talking about. "Why am I so cold?" Elisa said, while rubbing her arms, feeling the intense cold that clung to her. The other girls exchanged surprised glances. They thought Elisa was messing around with them. "So you don't remember?" another girl asked. Elisa stared at them strangely as she stood up from her bed. She yawned and stretched before walking into the bathroom. As she raised her head to look at the mirror after splashing water in her face, she saw the reflection of a scary, shadowy creature standing behind her. Elisa quickly turned, but there was nothing. Turning back to the mirror, she found an inscription written in blood. "Beware, it's too late to cry when the head is cut off." Elisa screamed as she rushed back into the room. "There's something in the bathroom," she said. The other girls were a bit scared at first. They eventually decided to take a look, but saw nothing. Only the faucet running, just as Elisa had left it. "I swear there was something. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes." Elisa's voice crackled. One of the girls shook her head in disagreement and approached Elisa, who sat on the floor shivering with fear. It's okay, she reassured Elisa soothingly. "You must be imagining things, or maybe you're not feeling well. You should probably go back to bed. In the morning, we'll figure out what to do about it." Elisa refused. She continued to swear that she saw something. Nobody would listen. The girls hopped back into their beds. It was quiet for a while. Then, out of nowhere, strange and unsettling sounds accompanied by bizarre whistling emanated from beneath Elisa's bed. The lights flickered and went off. Suddenly, Elisa began to scream. "I can feel its hands wrapping around me. Somebody help." The other girls screamed at the top of their voices and ran out of the room, leaving Elisa behind. The next morning, the hotel manager walked into the room with a tired face. The other girls had reported Elisa's strange and disturbing behavior and decided they couldn't cope with it for another night. After a brief check, the flickering lights were attributed to an issue with the electrical fittings, and the peculiar sounds to the old bed springs. The hotel staff moved Elisa to a new room closer to the top floor. It was less spacious than the former, but adorned with classical, fancy furniture. She dropped her bag in the large wardrobe and sat on the bed. The mattress was cozy. Grabbing the soft pillow, she squeezed it close to her chest. Feeling a bit more at ease, Elisa reached her diary and a pen, then began to scribble down her thoughts, hoping that putting them on paper would offer some semblance of clarity. As Elisa settled calmly on the bed, a sudden sound disrupted her sense of comfort. The sound of a running faucet. She dropped her diary and listened carefully. It was coming from the bathroom. She walked into it and stared at the water for a while. It was streaming. Elisa ran her hand under the water. "Ouch!" she screamed. It was really hot. She turned it off just as there was a loud sound in the room, like the shattering of glass. "Hello? Is anybody there?" Elisa asked with a shaky tone. There was no response. Elisa slowly walked out of the bathroom. On her bed lay the blood-smeared brick, surrounded by shattered glass that was also strewn across the floor. One of the windows was broken. Elisa peered through to see if anybody was there, but the street below was completely deserted. No people, no cars, no sounds. Elisa hesitated for a moment before reaching the blood-soaked brick. The blood was still warm. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper, similarly tainted with blood. She picked it up and opened it. The paper had a note, written in blood. "You cannot run from us. We are coming for you now." Elisa woke up, opening her eyes wide open and gasping heavily with her heart racing. She had fallen asleep over her diary. Still trying to calm her breathing, she struggled to regain her composure. She reached her diary and drew it near. However, she threw it away violently the instant her eyes fell upon the open page. The same ominous, blood-written note she had seen in her dream was now in the pages of her diary. "What's happening?" Elisa said with a trembling voice, while grabbing her head with both hands. Her eyes darted around the room as she desperately tried to regain a semblance of control over her fragile sense of reality. Then, 3 heavy knocks on the door reverberated through the room. Elisa was now scared to the tooth. The knocks repeated more violently, but she remained frozen, too terrified to react. Looking at the door, she could see a long shadow through the space beneath the door. The coldness of death fell on the entire place. After a sharp and high distortion sound, the stereo in the room started playing a melancholic and haunting melody. The doorknob began to turn slowly. Elisa curled up in a corner of her bed, petrified. The door swung open, but nobody was there. Gathering her courage, Elisa began to tiptoe towards the door and cautiously stepped into the corridor. Suddenly, a violent rush of wind surged into her room, slamming the door shut behind her with a resounding crash, followed by sounds of maniacal laughter. Elisa sprinted towards the elevator and called it. As she glanced back, she saw a bizarrely very tall and slender silhouette emerging from the now open door of her room. The faceless figure was clearly looking at her and coming after her, fast, with giant steps. The elevator's doors opened, and Elisa rushed into it. Frantically, she pressed the buttons to close the doors. However, the sinister figure reached her, planting itself between the doors and held them from shutting. There was nowhere to run. Elisa hid in a blind corner of the elevator, motionless. The figure gasped into the elevator for a while and then vanished into thin air. Elisa peeped out of the elevator. There was nothing. She then walked out and stared in both directions of the long passage. Silence hung heavy in the air. Then, just as suddenly as before, the maniacal laughter returned, its chilling crescendo filling the corridor. However, the elevator's security camera captured no sound, and the spectators, including detectives, hotel staff, and police officers, could only watch as Elisa bolted in the opposite direction and disappeared down the hallway. Days after Elisa was reported missing, this footage was discovered. Her bizarre behavior in the video only deepened the mystery surrounding her disappearance, leaving more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. It was the last time she was seen alive. Weeks after her disappearance, a member of the maintenance staff was alerted of the sudden drop in water pressure experienced by some guests. On the day he decided to inspect it, an unnatural coldness and breeze engulfed the rooftop. The man heard strange giggles and laughter. He looked around, but there was no one else up on the roof with him. He stared down from the rooftop. Nothing rare, just the unusual traffic down there. The sound of giggles a second time brought the man's attention back to the tanks. This time the sound was clear. It was coming from the tank directly in front of him. He climbed up the ladder and was surprised to find the service hole open. Looking inside the tank, he saw Elisa's naked body floating in the water, wrapped in a slimy green substance with her eyes wide open. A cloud of dark smoke emanated from her partially open mouth. It rushed towards the man, who fell off the ladder in fear. Years later, a new guest entered Elisa's room. Throwing himself onto the bed, he threw his keys onto the bedside table, but they fell in the space between the table and the wall. The guest bent over to search the floor, but the keys weren't there. Moving the table away from the wall, he found not only his keys, but Elisa's diary, too. Intrigued, he opened it. Inside, it was written, "Something is lurking in the hidden corners of this hotel. It is dark and sinister and thirsty for blood. I hear it call out my name. They say I'm crazy, but hear it clearly in my head. It's after me. It's after my life." The guest turned the page and read, "We are coming for you too, right now." 3 heavy knocks on the door reverberated through the room.